It has been a bit of a bumpy ride for the IEC as they were forced to put in place a credible local and government election in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the IEC's integrity was also questioned when it allowed the reopening of ward candidate lists as requested by the ANC. The big question now heading into the November 1st election is whether it will be free and fair. We continue this series of discussions with Asri's Ebrahim Fakir. Ibrahim, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran for having me, Maulana.
We'll start up in layman's terms. What constitutes free and fair elections?
Gosh, it's a really long list, but you got to look at three different periods. So there's a pre-election period, that is the period leading up to the election. There's the election period, that's the days, before the day of the election and the day after. And then you've got the post-election period, and the post-election period is relatively short. It's the time from when the election, when we go out to vote, to the time at which the results are announced. Now, that's just also a small slice, by the way, of the whole electoral cycle. But anyway, in the pre-electoral period, right, you would look at the conditions in society, the stability, the ability of political parties to reach out to voters. That means the ability to campaign, that they aren't blocked anywhere, that there isn't no-go areas, that there isn't high levels of political violence, that the political conflict between political parties doesn't break out into physical contact and so on. And then that there is relative peace and stability even within political parties, right? And that's in the pre-electoral period, but also that the legal framework is very much intact, that there aren't too many court cases, that there aren't disputes in the lead up to the election. And we know we've had one or two of those. On the day of the election and the day before the election is the code of conduct which all political parties signed. That is, in 24 hours before the day of the election, no one really has big rallies or campaigns. There isn't massive breakout of fights and so on. That also the IEC is relatively well prepared in terms of its logistical arrangements, administrative arrangements. Then on the day of the election, that no voters are disenfranchised. That means you or I or any other voter is not blocked from going to a voting station, that the voting stations actually open on time, that the electoral staff know what they're doing, that no one is barred from participating in the process, that you got the correct balloting material. So you don't rock up at a voting station in Lens and then you get a ballot paper for someone in a ward in Pietermaritzburg, for example. So those kind of things actually, I know it's silly, but they actually add to the freeness and fairness of the election. Then in the post-election period, is there an ability to observe the process? Can people relatively with ease see that there are no major maladministrative or malfeasant actions, that there isn't major ballot stuffing, that you don't suddenly find ballot papers lying on the side of the road, that there aren't ballot boxes stuffed with ballot papers which are hidden somewhere. So those kind of things, right? But in the process, in the pre-election process also, that there's opportunity to inspect the voters' roll and raise objections. Because remember, the Zimbabwean election at the turn of the century, what were the major complaints? That there are voters who have passed away who are on the voters' roll, that there are people who don't exist who are on the voters' roll, that there are people who are deceased and are under 18 who are not supposed to be on the voters' roll but are. And then there are people who should be on the voters' roll because they're registered, they're over 18, they meet all the requirements, but they're not. So all those kind of infractions, and if the legal environment is not conducive, then it detracts from the freeness and the fairness of the election. So basically, there are these markers, but it's a general common sense approach to what is free, what is fair. Generally, Maulana, no election around the world can be free of any administrative glitches. Yeah. Just think about this. 22,000 voting stations or thereabout. Each voting station has at the least 3 to 4 staff members, if not more. Now you multiply that. That's in the order of 120. Alhamdulillah. that's in the order of 120,000 people part of the electoral process. Something somewhere will go wrong, but the broad freeness and fairness is measured by the extent to which the participants and voters accept the outcome of the results.
Now, based on what you've just outlined very comprehensively, does the pandemic in any way impact on any of that?
It does to a significant degree. And that's why the finding made by former Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke was that it's not really conducive to have an election in this period. So in the pre-election period, if we look at the ability to campaign, parties more or less were able to do so relatively freely. But you couldn't have many of the big rallies. The extent of outreach was not the same. The conditions of the curfew mean that there are truncated hours. Now, I mean, we know the curfew is only from midnight. People aren't campaigning then. But the ability to have meetings, people print posters and T-shirts overnight. People do planning and campaigning because, you know, the electoral campaigners in that period, they don't sleep. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The conditions, though the restrictions were lifted, were slightly better than they may have been had we been under level 2 or level 3 lockdown. Many of us actually argued that I think the election should have been postponed, simply because we must be consistent. If in the early stages of the pandemic, we worried about the spread and we worried about the health services being overwhelmed, and we were worried about the super spreader events. And we agreed that places of worship, businesses, and other places should close. Then I think we ought to have been consistent, and some of us did argue that the elections ought to have been postponed, notwithstanding what the Constitution says. Because the Constitution is not cast in stone, can be amended, can be interpreted. There were routes out of this. I think the IEC tried, but look, by and large, you know, the campaigning period or the pre-election period was not marked by complete inability of parties to reach out to voters, nor was the environment so unstable that voters are not able to engage in political discourse. The legal aspects now, remember I said one of the big things about the pre-election period is that the legal process must be stable, must be coherent, and must be well codified. And our electoral laws are well codified. But there were a few instances in which the pandemic kind of brought about unforeseen circumstances. First is that I think we were all laboring under the misapprehension that the Constitutional Court would in fact allow a postponement, and perhaps the IEC chose the wrong route. They ought to have gone together with Parliament after Parliament made a resolution and then try and approach the court, but be that as it may, it was not granted. The relief they sought was not granted. The postponement was not granted. What that did is that it annulled the initial proclamation, and that initial proclamation meant that when the first cutoff in terms of the electoral timetable, cutoff date for submission of candidate names and lists, the ANC missed a few of those. Lucky for them, the court found that the election can't be postponed, and because it said that, it reopened the whole process, which means that the deadlines that they did originally miss, they could now catch up on. That the DA then suddenly went to court, and they went to court to say, this should not have been allowed. You can allow for the registration of voters, but don't open the list process for parties to resubmit names of candidates and PR lists. But the court found, well, that's also allowed because the whole process now has been completely reopened. Then there was another court case. In this case, Herman Mashaba, who it was revealed that his party was unable to fill out a simple form because they claim that they were not able to put on the ballot paper the full name of their party, because in the ward ballot paper, Molana, it is not the full name of the party, it is the name of the candidate, because in a ward it's a candidate who's actually standing. It's the name of the candidate with the abbreviation or acronym of the party and the party's logo. They claimed in public that their voters would be disenfranchised because their names won't appear on the ward ballot paper. That's untrue. Their names would appear on the ward ballot paper. The only thing that would not appear is the name or the abbreviation of the party. But that's because on the regulated form, they did not fill out the abbreviation. When asked, do you have an abbreviation? They said not applicable. Now they're going to contest this in court, and let's see what happens. It can have a material impact because remember, part of the local government election has a ward component. That means there must be a distinct ballot paper. Your PR portion of the ballot paper is the same for your whole municipality. But every ward would have different candidates, and therefore those ballot papers are specific. Now they have to be contracted out, they have to be designed, they have to be printed, produced, and then they have to be delivered. So there's a lot of logistical and administrative work that goes into this, and the court better find quickly on where this process should go. So those 3 court cases, 2 of them settled, 1 not yet. They could potentially mark and raise issues around freeness and fairness, but it seems to me by and large those will be settled. We now have to watch the period in the lead up, that the political tolerance remains the way it is, that there isn't major conflict, that there aren't new court cases which are brought, that the multi-party liaison committees of the IEC actually function, and that on the day, the administrative arrangements are all in track. That means voting stations open on time, that there aren't people who are disenfranchised, that are not allowed to vote for one or other reason, of course, provided that they are registered and they meet the regulatory requirements, that the ballot papers and materials are all intact, and then in the post-election period, that we don't find stray ballot boxes, stray ballot papers, stuffed ballot papers which are not stamped with the official stamp of the IEC, that voting stations don't not open at all or open too late, and so on.
All right. Very quickly, Ebrahim, as we conclude, do you think that there is a greater chance this time around of the results being challenged because of the factors that we've discussed?
It's anyone's guess, Mola, to be honest. But remember that this election is so diverse. Every little municipality is basically you having 284 mini elections. It means an election in 284 different municipalities or thereabouts. So the likelihood of it being challenged in one or other place, the potential is there, but the regulatory safeguards and the oversight safeguards are very much intact. And I can tell you what they are. First, every party was allowed to make objections on the voters' roll if they chose to do so. Every party was allowed to raise objections to candidates who should not be there. Every party was able to inspect the voters' roll. Second, there are multi-party liaison committees, as just mentioned. Those meet once a week with the IEC before an election. If parties don't attend, that's their problem. But every major decision made by the IEC is subject to discussion and approval at the multi-party liaison committee. Third, if there is no joy there, every party is entitled and allowed to have party agents to watch the process and to watch the counting, and more importantly, to sign off on the count. By law, the results of every voting station must be posted outside their voting station. That parties don't have party agents or don't have agents who watch the count is also their problem. That can't be helped by the public. Third, there are conflict management panels to which you can refer disputes to for arbitration. And if you don't have joy there, then there's the electoral court ultimately. So the oversight process, the regulatory process, the consultative process is extremely tightly managed and is very robust. So I don't think people should fear that there will be major infractions in the process, inshallah.
All right, Ebrahim, shukran so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. That was Asri's Ebrahim Fakir talking to us about understanding what constitutes a free and fair election. Just go on 7:35. We break now for the latest news headlines and traffic. We come back with Maulana Wajah.